History of the Soul War by eddieddi. Lesson 10. Federation Retreats and the Future Opens. The lecturer looked at his students. They looked worried and stressed. This was the last lecture, and they had but a single decacycle to finish their coursework.
I am glad to see that most of you attended the Admiral's lecture. This is our final lecture on the Soul War. We will be covering the Federation's retreat from human-controlled space and the peace talks that occurred, as well as recent events.
He moved on to the first slide, a battered and ruined Federation fleet with a large orange gas giant in the background.
This is the location that was given minimum distance humanity would accept as a fair retreat distance for the Federation fleet. Though it was made clear that while humanity was well out of range of any Federation weapons, the Federation fleet was still in striking range of the Four Horsemen. It was at this location that the Federation fleet watched humanity retake the locations that the Federation had bled and suffered to hold on to. Federation troops were offered the choice of surrender or death. Sometimes they were not offered that choice. Those that held Mars were not given the option, as the guerrilla fighters were still causing issues and holding out. While on Luna, the war was quick and painless. Once the human mobile suit units had been deployed, most of the extended Luna bases surrendered, not wishing to face the silent, implacable monsters humanity had made. Earth itself was a mixed bag.
He moved on to the next slide. The Four Horsemen held in silent position facing the Federation fleet, silent, ominous, and an ever-present threat. Between them was a collection of human ships, repainted and clearly stolen Federation shuttles, and a single human dreadnought.
This is the meeting between the Federation and humanity at the retreat of the Federation fleet. There are no recordings of this meeting. However, humanity explained that if the Federation retreated from human-controlled space and from the nearest habitable systems, then humanity would cease prosecuting the war against Federation forces. However, it still had to hunt down and eliminate any rogue elements that either side faced. It also informed the Federation that several human naval elements had gone rogue, and that any actions taken by said rogue elements were not indicative of humanity's intentions. This is believed to be the forces that burned the Torsek homeworld.
He looked at the class. They seemed not to react. At this point, they were well aware of what rogue elements meant and what had happened.
The Federation agreed to these terms, on the condition that humanity did not deploy any military forces towards Federation space. Humanity insisted on a band of space that neither side could place military forces in. The Federation was forced to agree.
He moved on to the next slide. This was an image of a fleet of ships, clearly human-made, over the Tricol homeworld, right above their heads.
Normally, I would spend the rest of the lecture going over the 2 centuries of non-conflict, the minor issues that happened, the armed trader agreement, and counter-piracy declarations, but a lot of that is no longer relevant due to events that took place over the last 5 cycles. This is Strike Fleet Asir. This is not an image, but rather a live feed from an observation satellite. As you all know, the Federation invited Strike Fleet Asir and its admiral to speak as a gesture of goodwill and a reopening of diplomatic communications. 200 solar cycles after the war has ended. Humanity seemed more than willing to agree to this, and as you can see, Strike Fleet Asir is currently in a defensive orbit of a Federation homeworld. This renders a lot of the minor issues, stretching back over the previous solar cycles, not worth studying for anything other than historical record-keeping.
He shifted one of his antennae, in an indication of thoughtfulness.
Humanity has been trading with the Federation for almost a century and a half now. The position of the Federation was that so long as the trade benefited the Federation, it was approved. Now, however, it is clear that it is being called into question. There is little that can be added from a historical perspective, so there is little to study here. I can only encourage you to document all that goes on here for historical records and ensure you have your coursework in on time.
He moved on to the next slide, an image of several large Federation trade vessels.
On the topic of trade, the general trade between the Federation and human space has been for Federation technology or raw resources in return for human-made goods or unique resources. Humanity is the foremost producer of recreational intoxicants and unique food products in the local galactic cluster, meaning that most of humanity's trade consists of consumables, whereas a lot of what they purchase is large pieces of technology or raw resources required to further their scientific research or production capabilities. Over the past 2 centuries, this has led them to catching up with the Federation.
He paused.
I apologize if this lecture is short. However, it is difficult to give a lesson on history as it is unfolding right above our heads. The rest of this lecture will be dedicated to any questions or assisting in the writing of your coursework.